Okay, so this lecture is an overview of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm going to talk you through its structure, its significant individuals, and what this diagram means. So we're going to break this down to explain to you the key significant individuals and groups and what each of them do and how much power they hold. So we're going to start by looking at the intentions of the CCP. So the CCP met on the 29th of September 1949. Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, met with 14 other parties where he was to decide the aims and intentions of his government. Okay, so the whole aim of this conference, which is known as the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, the whole intention of this conference was to decide the aims and intentions of Mao's government. It was successful in its aims because it then published this thing called the Common Programme, which set out Mao's aims for China. And within it, he stated that China would be known as a people's democratic dictatorship. So I kind of want to break down this idea of people's democratic dictatorship. The idea of democracy is that everybody has a voice and everybody has a right to vote. However, the idea of dictatorship is that there is one person on the top and that person decides the laws and enforcements of a country. So already within the Common Programme there is contradictory decisions, and this idea of communism is being contradicted by this idea of dictatorship. But that is how he decided that the party would rule China. It would be the People's Democratic Dictatorship. So essentially stating that the people would be able to vote, however ultimately the rulings would come down to the Chinese Communist Party. The communist government would listen to the people, but they would rule as a one-party dictatorship headed by Mao. So they would listen, that's the idea of democracy, but ultimately it would be a one-party state led by Mao Zedong. So, how does he do that? Mao sits at the top, so he is our chairman and he is the president. Okay, so he holds two really significant roles here. He's the chairman, so he's in charge of all these people down here, and as the president, he's also in charge of all of these people in this section. So he's given himself the most significant roles within the party. In order to try and maintain control, the government of China was immediately reorganised. Its 18 provinces were grouped into 6 regions. So essentially what he's done is the provinces, which is kind of down here, we've got our citizens, they are initially broken into 18 separate sections. But in order to try and maintain control, he makes that into 6 smaller regions of larger groups of people. And what that allows him to do is to centralise power and centralise control in a much more efficient fashion. Within each region, they have a People's Congress, okay, and that's run at different levels. You've got towns, you've got your districts, your cities, your counties, and your provinces within the party congress. And what that means is he can put people in charge of the party congress who he trusts. Okay, and those people bring their ideas and decisions to the Central Committee, who then take it to this group of people known as the Politburo. Now, the Politburo are essentially the decision-making body of the Communist Party. They decide and vote on laws and legislature. But because of this idea of people's democratic dictatorship, despite the Politburo deciding on laws, voting on laws, ultimately the power lies with the chairman to decide whether or not that is passed. And that becomes known as democratic centralism. So decisions are voted upon by the Politburo here, however the final say lies with the chairman. Okay, so he can veto the decisions of the Politburo. He can say, yes, actually I agree with their decisions, or no, I do not agree with their decisions, and therefore the law is not passed. Okay, so they are controlled by Mao, the chairman. In addition to this, in addition to having a chairman and a president, they also have a premier, and that person is the Prime Minister. Okay, and traditionally the Prime Minister also holds the role as Foreign Minister, which means they are responsible for ensuring China's relationships with the international countries, well, the global countries, is positive. In this case, in 1949, somebody called Zhou Enlai is appointed Premier of China. Okay, he's Premier and he is Foreign Minister. So as Premier, he is in charge of government bureaucracy. So he effectively runs the country with its many different departments and ministries. So these bureaucrats and these ministries here, the people who are in charge of the sectors of society, so you've got a health minister, an education minister. Zhou Enlai, the Premier, is in charge of that group of people. So the Premier holds quite a significant amount of power, which means that this person is somebody that the chairman and the president trusts quite significantly, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to run the bureaucrats and the ministries in the fashion that the chairman would have wanted. So in theory, the Premier would propose laws which be voted on by Congress, these Congress members here, and then go up to the Politburo. However, in reality, this was very different. The Premier was in charge of ensuring these individuals followed the rules decided by the chairman, and that is because of this idea of democratic centralism. So Mao made the decisions, and Zhou Enlai, the Premier, had to ensure that the bureaucrats followed these decisions. So that is, as we said, this idea of democratic centralism, that the party itself would be ruled by democratic centralism, and they would listen, however, as a party they would listen, however, ultimate decision making lied with the chairman. And within the Politburo, it was consisted of 13 individuals who would make these decisions. So that kind of covers this section here and this section here. We then have this bottom bit here, which is our citizens and our danvai. The citizens are your general everyday citizens of China. They are grouped into these sections called danvais. Now the danvai is the working body. Okay, so each of the areas of society is grouped together to create a danvai. These are the working bodies of China and China's population. They are controlled by the congresses, and they are controlled by their regions and their districts, and by the bureaucrats and the ministers. Okay, now each danvai has got a cadre who is in charge of them. Okay, so this individual is in charge of ensuring that the danvai, the working body, is following the decisions laid out by the chairman and the Politburo. So you can see that each section of society is controlled by an individual who is quite prominent within the Communist Party. Okay, because a cadre would be somebody who is a trusted individual. So we have our danvais and we have our citizens. Then we have this section here, which is our president and our PLA, which stands for People's Liberation Army. Now, in 1949, the president is Mao Zedong. Okay, and initially he rules the People's Liberation Army. Okay, they won the war, the Civil War, and it starts off with 5 million soldiers, and they play a key role in the government. Because what they do, the PLA is put in charge of the 6 regions of China. Okay, they have to manage these regions. It is their job to patrol and to ensure that the people within these regions are following the rules laid out by the Communist Party. Okay, so they obeyed the president. They took direct orders from the president. And initially, as I said, this is Mao Zedong. However, what he later does in 1950 is he puts this man called Peng Dehuai in charge of the People's Liberation Army. Okay, because it's a significant job, and he trusted Peng Dehuai. He was one of his trusted advisors, so he puts him in charge of the PLA. However, this goes wrong because the PLA are used to rebuild transport routes and infrastructure. Okay, so following the end of the Civil War, the PLA are also used to rebuild China, not only by ensuring that people are listening to the laws laid out by the CCP, but also by providing the manpower in factories and farming and in rebuilding transport and the infrastructure. So they're playing quite a significant role in establishing communist control because they're ensuring people are listening and helping to rebuild the country so that people support the communists. So, Peng Dehuai is given responsibility over the PLA in 1950. This is a significant responsibility because the PLA have such an active role in establishing communist control. Peng Dehuai speaks out against the president, okay? And that angers Mao, so what he does in retaliation is replaces him with this man called Lin Biao. Okay, so Lin Biao then becomes head of the PLA in 1956. Okay, and that's important to remember because that helps the rise of the PLA. Okay, they become significantly more powerful, and that means that the role of the president becomes more significant and the leader of the PLA. So, because the PLA have such an active role in society and establishing communist control, the leader of the PLA also, in return, has quite a significant amount of power. Okay, so they are level with the president in this case. Therefore, it is important that the head of the PLA is somebody that the president trusts, somebody that the chairman trusts, and somebody who also has similar views of the premier, the Prime Minister of China. So, to summarise, a significant amount of power of government within the government lies with the chairman, the premier, the president, and the head of the PLA. Ultimate power and decision making lies with the chairman, and that is because of this idea of democratic centralism. The Politburo is a decision making body. However, due to democratic centralism, the power lies with the chairman. The premier is responsible for ensuring that the bureaucrats and the ministers are following decisions made by the CCP, and the citizens are controlled by members of the PLA, therefore ensuring that everybody is following rules laid out by the Chinese Communist Party. And that kind of summarizes the power structure of the government laid out by the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so ultimately power is centralized.